What's up, Internet? John here from NextGen. A couple years ago I wrote a blog post detailing a custom wiring job I put into a 212 cab I built for a friend of mine. It was a bit of a unique wiring job because he likes to have mono and stereo options in his cab, but he previously had blown amplifiers from having the wrong switch or the jack plugged into the wrong place, things like that. And so he wanted me to make him a wiring system for the back of his cab that was more or less dummy proof. So it didn't involve a switch and you couldn't accidentally plug it into the wrong jack. And I came up with something that worked really well for him. And as it turns out, after much begging, I'm here building another one. So I figured I'd film it this time and take you along for the ride, show you the process. But before I continue, I want to make sure I mention, no, we do not do custom wiring jobs or custom builds for customers. These are private, personal, one-off things that I do on the side, and frankly I don't really have a lot of time, so I very rarely, if ever, do them. You should be able to follow along with the blog post. I'll put the link in the description, and if you have any trouble, then there's undoubtedly a tech somewhere in your area that will be able to do it for you or help you walk you through it. So this is the wiring diagram I came up with. The concept is simple. You use one jack when you want mono, and it won't actually matter which jack you plug into. Or you use both jacks simultaneously when you want stereo. And in this example, if you're using 16 ohm speakers, it'll give you either 8 ohms on either jack if you just use one of the jacks. And if you use both jacks simultaneously, it actually separates the two signal paths, so you get each jack just goes to one speaker. And then there's your mono and stereo option, and it's more or less dummy proof because no matter what you plug into, you'll get at least a reasonable load on your amp. I drew this out using the Switchcraft 14V as the template, only because I'm really used to working with Switchcraft jacks. Pro tip, always prepare your workstation with all the tools and parts you need ahead of time. So I've got the wiring diagram here because clearly I don't really recall exactly what I did, but it's always good to have something for reference, even if you do remember. Working with these kinds of jacks generally throws people off because of all the layers. I can certainly see why at first, but you do get used to it eventually. Each layer that you see is a wafer of metal. So like this lug is an entire wafer. So you can follow this whole wafer around until you find where it comes up, and you can see that it comes up here. So you can tell that that lug on the bottom is actually for the tip hot, because that's where the wafer goes. And then you can find the next level. Next level is this lug, and again you just sort of follow the wafer around and see where it goes up. And you can see here it goes up this one. So that second lug that I pointed at is the tip ring and sleeve. So this would be the ring. And again, and you just kind of go through the process like that. And the sleeve is always sort of the top one here that's attached to the center of the jack. So just learn to sort of follow the wafers. Or if you want to make your life a lot easier, just use a clip style jack and it's a lot more obvious. First things first, I'm going to prep the jack a little bit. I'm going to apply flux to both sides of all the lugs. And yes, I should have a brush for this. This is actually a piece of a plastic fork that we never threw out. Probably from a poutine or something that I ate from a local eatery. When you're a hobbyist and not a professional, and you don't have a lot of money for tools, you work with what you got. So there you go. Flux applied to all the lugs, both sides. The wire is already pre-tinned, so I won't really need to apply flux to it, but I can dip it in flux if I want. So I'm going to get started following the diagram. We'll get some solder. Looking good, nice and shiny on both sides. So we're done this jack. I'm just twisting the wire between the two. That's going to go between the two jacks so that it's not rattling in the cab because the extra wire you don't really want loose in the cab. So there you go, twisted wire. And in my overzealous twisting, I forgot to label which wire was which at the other end, so fun times. I'm gonna untwist it and actually figure out which wire is which, then retwist it and do it all over again. So all these little dark spots here are burnt flux, and you can clean that up with alcohol, because you actually want to clean up all your solder joints with alcohol after you're done. The reason is burnt flux, if you use flux especially, or flux core solder, which most of you are probably using flux core solder. That stuff is actually corrosive over time, and you get oxidation on your joints, on your solder joints, which you don't want. So after you do all those joints, you're going to want to clean it up with a brush and some rubbing alcohol. Isopropyl alcohol, let's say 90% or better is ideal, and good to go. You know what? I freaking love pushback wire. So much better than having a strip wire. So there's a lot of ways to attach these little quick crimp terminal connectors onto wire. I'll show you the way I do it. I like to do it this way. I find it gives you a really secure connection that won't be a failure point. I dip the wire in some flux because I want the wire itself to draw the solder, because it's thicker and heavier than these crimps. Tighten the crimp down onto the wire, so you wind up with a really physically secure connection. And then it's no joke, it's just a bead of solder for a couple of seconds, not even that. I got a little bit of solder on the iron, 1, 2, and you can see the solder is being drawn through the crimp terminal onto the wire, and you're good. You've got a nice solid connection. And that, at least the point between the wire and the crimp, will never be a failure point. The crimp may break if you yank on it and twist it too much, or the wire may become damaged somehow. But as far as that particular joint itself, you're golden. That should last you forever. So the other one I did was to demonstrate. I don't typically do them and solder them one at a time. I will prep all of the ends first and then kind of solder them all in one go, because it just goes a little bit faster that way. All the ends are done. Now I'm just going to solder them all. And to do that, I literally just hold them one at a time and follow the method I showed you earlier. That bead of solder, apply, let the flux pull the solder through the crimp terminal onto the wire. Done, set it aside. Done that, inspect all my edges one at a time, inspect all the solder joints, make sure there's solder on both the wire and the end of each one. All right, to recap, we are done. First off, we got 18-inch wires that go from the jacks to the speakers. That way they can cross over and go wherever you want them, and you're not going to have any issues. This is a 12-inch twisted lead, twisted to keep it nice and tight, prevent it from having any issues. And these two jacks themselves will be the two jacks used on the cab. And just to recap, the way this is going to work is when you plug one plug into either one of the two jacks. So if you plug one thing into this one, you'll get an 8 ohm load, because the 216 ohms speakers will be in parallel. If you plug one jack into this one, and again, nothing in that one, only one plug into one jack, again, you're getting 8 ohms because the 2 speakers will be in parallel. And then, if you want to run it in stereo, you plug one jack into each side, and what that does is it breaks the parallel connection between the 2 speakers, and you wind up with one jack going to one speaker and the other jack going to the other speaker, and each jack then becomes a 16 ohm load. So it's pretty dummy proof, or as dummy proof as I can make it. That way, anytime you have something plugged into anywhere, you're never downloading down to 4 ohms, and you're always going to have some kind of a load, and hopefully the one you want. All in all, this is probably less than $25 worth of parts, less than 10 if you use cheaper alternatives like cheaper wire and cheaper jacks, which is way cheaper than any pre-wired jack plate on the market. So if you've got some soldering skills, give it a shot on your next cab build. It's nice and simple and almost dummy proof, or at least as dummy proof as it can be. So build safe and build awesome.